I am not at all against technology. In fact, I am deeply interested in it, and I'm not against AI or machine learning or whatever they call it. I think it's fascinating and helpful. I think MRI scans are amazing technology, but thinking that an MRI scan is the same as understanding a human, and thinking that you can reduce us to chemical reactions and neurons firing is just a completely bonkers and untrue.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them.
Christian Madsbjerg is a professor of applied humanities at the New School and a co-founder of the pioneering Red Associates, a consultancy with offices in Copenhagen and New York City, which brings the human sciences to bear on strategic business problems, mostly dealing with companies in trouble. Christian writes, speaks, and teaches on the practical application of the human sciences, latest as a professor of applied humanities at the New School for Social Research. His work has been featured in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, the Washington Post, Der Spiegel, and Bloomberg Businessweek. His latest book, Sensemaking, The Power of the Humanities in the Age of the Algorithm, was released in the spring of 2017 by Hachette Book Group and is out in 16 languages. Christian is a fascinating thinker, and our conversation covers growing up on a small island near Sweden, his work with Lego, helping them identify harmful false assumptions around play and childhood, the critical value of the humanities in business and why it's been overlooked for so long, the value of slowing down, his book Sensemaking, his skepticism around AI, big data, and design thinking, and many other topics. I'm a big believer in the power of the humanities, from anthropology to history, poetry to philosophy, to teach us critical tools and skills for the world of business. And I think this conversation will be eye-opening to many people. It's one of a dozen or so weekly conversations we already have lined up for you with thinkers, designers, makers, best-selling authors, entrepreneurs, and impact investors who are working to change our world for the better. So follow this podcast on your favorite podcast app or head over to remakepod.org to subscribe. And now let's jump right in with Christian Madsbjerg. All right. I'm sitting here across the screen from Christian Madsbjerg. Christian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
And so the usual first question these days is about the COVID situation that we're still in. So I'd love to hear your COVID experience. Where did it catch you in the world? And what was that like? How did it affect you personally and then at work?
So I live in New York City, and I live on 13th Street. And very early in March, the whole place shut down. People left. So people that live here on Manhattan, not all of them, but many, have the luxury of being able to relocate somewhere else. And many did. So the streets just emptied out. And it was a pretty dark period for a while. And the schools shut down. And I have 3 kids. So we had to take over and deal with our kids. And the school, of course, they were just trying to make it work somehow. But of course, it's not anywhere near what it is to go to school. I mean, I have 2 boys and they had each other, but I have a daughter as well. And you could see her sort of sink into a different mood than she was before because she was alone a lot of the time. And you can do a lot of things online, but it's not the same. And you could see a lot of her friends fall off the grid and, I don't know, not checking in with each other. So that was not a good experience. But of course, we're 2 people and we could handle it. Then demonstrations happened, which was around, late May in New York City. And 14th Street and Union Square was very much the center in in Manhattan, together with Soho. And that meant that the entire streets shut down, everything was boarded up. The tri-state area ran out of plywood, and quite a lot of things were smashed. So at a certain point, we had burning police cars outside of the house, and that scared my kids a lot. So living in the middle of it was unpleasant. However relevant the source of the frustration and the demonstrations and the anger, it was rough to live with little kids in the middle of it. And then we try to get a handle on it, and the schools try to get a handle on it, and it slowly came back to life. But it was fine for me. I could work at home, or have an office nearby I could go to that was fairly empty, and I could do things like that. And so could my wife. But the kids really took a toll, and particularly the kids that were behind already. You could see the kids that maybe didn't have that support structure falling off and sort of getting knocked back another year. So I was deeply concerned. I was, as a social scientist or someone that's interested in data, I was manically collecting data about what was going on, quantitative data about jobs and hunger and what happened, which was very different from the discussion in, New York Times, which was 30 million people lost their job within 4 or 5 weeks. And you had hunger returning, and you had lots of misery and despair happening. And so I was focused on this moment of catching what happened, because it's something that won't happen, I hope, again, where the structures of society are laid bare, and you can suddenly see our real priorities. And you could see what we are willing to shut the world down for, and especially what the elite newspaper and political conversation and business conversation is about, and then what's happening right now at the climate change discussions, where we're not willing to shut the world down. It's very clear what's important once you see it laid bare like that. So, which is not something you can usually see. So I was sort of panicking in terms of just trying to save whatever we could learn from the moment.
Yeah, that's interesting. Seeing COVID as a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime experiment that you can really learn from. What are some of the insights that came through looking at this information?
I mean, one is nerdy, which is methodologically. So if you want to understand systems, social systems, they're usually hidden. But once they're taken away, you can see it. So an example is, if you lose your mobile phone in the back of a taxi, let's say, you really understand what a mobile phone is and how it's integrated into your life. And only then can you understand it. So it's so close and so permeates our life that we can only see it when it's gone. Sort of his classic example from an ethnomethodologist called Harold Garfinkel. If you are in line in a coffee shop, you don't see the line, you just do it. You're just in the middle of it, and that's what's appropriate, and it's what one does. But if somebody breaks the line, suddenly swoops in and cuts in line, then suddenly you see that there are rules here, and we're not following them right now. So the absence of something is actually more clarifying than the presence of it. The silence of something is more illuminating than the voice of something. So when something is gone, when colleagues are gone, when, for my students, when dating is gone, you really understand what it is, So that's the nerdy, methodologically interesting thing that was so clear. You also learn how things are connected. So if the coffee shop closed, then there's the distributor of coffee, and then there's the trucks, and the entire supply chain of the coffee system just breaks down, and you suddenly see the interconnectedness of the coffee supply chain and the kind of system it supports. And I thought there was a lack of interest in that. There was an interest in epidemiology. There was an interest in all that, but there was very little interest in the hunger it created and how kids were knocked back in school. Millions and millions of kids in America never checked in on their online school. So if you imagine, you might be from a place where that is not a must, then that's likely correlating with not being in front of the educational system and then being knocked back a year and a half like that. We're going to deal with that the next decade. So it's kind of a social 9/11 that if you talked about that in March or April, or you can start talking about it now. I got in a lot of trouble for saying, listen, this is creating hunger. And we knocked out 20, 30 million jobs for people that on average had $400 to their name.
Yeah.
Like no infrastructure, no buffer, no cushion for dealing with it. And no talk about how we need social support and taxation to support that social support. It was just not present in the conversation. It was all about epidemiologists and disease-related things. And it's not that I don't think that's important, but it's just not the only thing. It's very easy to work from home if you have a job like you and me, where you still get a paycheck and it's still possible. It might even be nicer for some people, not for me, but for other people. And then maybe the last thing, there are lots of things, but the last thing is how we ran out of creativity, and that you cannot create, not really, online. We relied on the ideas from before. And you could see that in my students, they just ran out of steam just by sheer loneliness. And so how much space means, like being with others in terms of moving in your life and feeling that you do something. And I could see that in the people I work with, that they just after 6 months, they ran out of steam and things became boring and just not new. So I think the whole thing about remote work is a big lie, especially if you work in a creative field. I don't think it's possible in the long run. It's parasitic on previous creativity that came through the interaction with others.
I may challenge you on that in a minute, because I'm the biggest proponent of being in the same room when you're dealing with a creative enterprise, but we really didn't have a choice. So we were brought in kicking and screaming, because what we do is run product design workshops with our clients, and the clients still needed to work on new products, and we couldn't fly to be with them. And obviously we had to dig it to find the right tools and find the right processes. And it's very imperfect, but I feel still pretty good about the problems we were able to solve and the new products we were able to design. And the way we did this is to simulate space, right? So with tools like Miro and Zoom, to make it feel like we're actually there together and talking and have snacks, and we did coffee breaks and then come back and did some more work. It's hard work, but when you don't have a choice, you find a way.
And you saw that everywhere. I'm the chair of an architectural firm, and it's hundreds of people, and you could just see them run out of steam. And most of it was loneliness. Most of it was just sitting at your desk, and there was no punctuation in the day. And that doesn't mean you can't make it happen, and we sort of had to. But all I'm saying is it's not good. I taught classes for students at the university I work at, and we had Miro boards and all kinds of tools, but there's no Miro board that can replace a whiteboard. It's just not. It's a support mechanism for when you don't have it. You could just see the blood drain from their faces. You could just see the energy sucked out of the room. I really felt sorry for them, because they weren't happy. They weren't enjoying it, and education suffered from it. And we did our best, and a lot of people did it better than I did, but suddenly it wasn't great for me or for my students. And then another thing was the academy has increasingly been siloed, right? So economics people talk to economics people, and anthropologists talk to anthropologists in their own reviews and in their own way and in their own language. And in economics, it's math, really, they talk through economic models. And here you saw a version of it, which was virus science, right? Or epidemiology, that had its own models, its own logic, and so on, that everybody just relied on, instead of saying, maybe school teachers should have a say. People that understand kids, people that understand social affairs, people that understand differences between people's income and social capacity or economic capacity. That wasn't in the picture. And that's an illness that comes out of universities, I think, and the way universities have been specialized. And it was made so clear during at least the first 6 months.
So I want to get us back on track with actually getting into your story a little bit. And so we have this question that we usually start with, which is, what's something you learned in childhood or early in life anyway, that still drives you today and guides you today, that's still alive?
I don't know. I was sort of an introverted kid into reading and sort of observing rather than being involved in life. And that observer role I've always had. And the key tool I have is looking and listening without judging, without trying to conclude too quickly. And I grew up on a little island south of Sweden, a tiny place that collapsed economically, collapsed because of the cod fishery. Basically, they took all the cod, and that was the economic, engine for the place. And then I saw this whole society collapse. I was in a good place. I came from a sort of a middle class family with a lot of care and so on, but I just saw the people around me collapse with the economy. And when you live in a situation like that, you end up trying to understand it. And the only way I knew was to observe. And that's what I made a living from the rest of my life. And it's what I teach, and it's what I'm writing a new book about. And I already wrote several about the tool of observation and the purity of just shut up and listen. And I suppose that's not something I learned. It's just something I am. So maybe that's something I bring from seeing something dramatic happen and trying to understand it.
So how do you draw a line from this observant childhood to your early projects you have a project with Lego and some other famous projects. How do you get from here to there?
I thought I would be a professor, and I was told that's what I should do. And then I went to university and I found that's not nice. I just saw what it was to lead that life. If you were not a tenured professor, your life is not great. You have to teach 8 classes and you never get to think of, you have no resources, you have no support system. And even if you're tenured, it seemed like all life had been knocked out of them by then. People were so unhappy. Yet I liked theory, I liked philosophy, and that's what I went up doing. But then after university, I thought, I'm not going to be an academic, but so how do I make a living? I got to pay rent and so on. And then I thought, these theories are very clearly helpful. And the sort of the connection to real society or companies or, anything really, shouldn't it be based, some of it at least, be based on understanding humans? And that's what I was interested. I was interested in the philosophy of understanding us. So I went to read sort of phenomenology and hermeneutics and that tradition. And it just made so much sense to me. And then I thought, well, how about I try to convince people to do that, actively do it, instead of just writing papers about it. And then somebody put up their hand, and I'm eternally grateful for that. And then someone else saw it and thought, well, that's neat. And then sometimes it even worked. And you could see that the kind of work we did was helpful to people. And then bigger companies and governmental agencies and nonprofits and so on started saying that is new and refreshing. And we hadn't thought about that. We have other tools that seem to be overlapping with it, but not like this. We started working for big German companies, and then Americans called, and then the Japanese were interested. It came by itself and came by the being so weird, I think. And when you're looking for trying to understand a world of something, the world of running or the world of cars or the world of, right now, the metaverse, if you want to understand a world, it seems like studying it would be helpful. And then they were looking for tools, and this was just another one. And then it turned out, sometimes at least, it worked. And either it worked by helping commercially or helping people that worked there or helping make better things or fewer things. So it wasn't really a plan. I never had a strategy. I never had an idea. It was never like that. It was just stumbling into things, but believing that these theories and this particular way of combination of observation and phenomenological theory was just so obvious. Why wouldn't you do that? And then I discovered anthropology, and I discovered that they had those tools. And that was deeply inspirational and so on. And I stole a lot of that. So it was much more chaotic than a linear sort of ramp of even increments. It just happened. I was lucky, I suppose, and particularly lucky with meeting the right people at the right time to do it with.
So I love the story of your work with Lego, because it's such a beloved company, such a powerful brand today, but it wasn't always as successful.
Right. Yeah, it's a case that helped us a lot, that people heard about it and CEOs started talking about that case. So it was helpful. And it was also fun to do. It was chaotic when we did it. But Lego was in real trouble and about to go belly up. It had lost, I think, 200 or 300,000 euros a day for 10 years.
Yeah.
So just absurd amount of money. And of course, the owners were able to support it, but there was something wrong. And then a new, very young CEO came in, and he just asked questions that were very fundamental. Like, why do children play? If you're Lego, that's a bold question to present. Like, of all people, they should know. But he was sort of honest enough and had enough audacity and I suppose humility to start asking those questions. And there was a CMO as well, so a chief marketing officer, that had the same intuition that there's something fundamentally wrong. And then somehow, I can't remember how, but we were then asked, could you look at our assumptions about children's play? Could you look at how we think about it? And then could you compare that with children, actual children? Could you compare our fundamental presuppositions or hidden assumptions by looking at us, using those observation tools, and could you compare it with what's going on in the world? And I remember I went to LA to meet children, and we were sort of on our knees playing with them and trying to figure out what their world was like, and hang out with their parents and their grandparents and so on. And we did that many places in the world, and basically photographed the whole thing and documented it, and had massive data sets coming out of that. And then we just showed that their assumptions about children's play weren't always right. There were many of them that were, but there were some of them that had driven the product design since the 90s at that point, that just weren't true and were sort of internal truths and toxic assumptions, really. And then we said, how about we replace those? What would then happen? And that meant that if what we found was true, then at least 70% of the portfolio wasn't relevant for the kids. And maybe that's why it didn't sell. And not about price, not about all those business things. It was just about children playing. They just had this moment where they had to do something, and they knocked out 70% of their portfolio. That was the first thing.
Wow.
And then the second thing was, what's the pipeline of innovation? What's the pipeline of new things that we should do? How do we build our own IP, which became Lego movies and Ninjago and all kinds of things like that? What are children's worlds like? So then their internal design teams that are large and very skilled took it and built a whole new company, really, out of a new philosophy, a new set of assumptions that then turned out to be true. And boom, now they're the biggest play brand in the world. Yeah. And most of the success came from these many people involved, but the CEO, the owner, and the CMO just did it, just went for it and bold, right? And bet the company on it. And that was just amazing.
What was the short of it? What was the assumption that you identified that wasn't right? And what was the truth of the matter?
Yeah, so there are many things, but maybe the main one is their assumption was computer games will take over everything, and there's no role for the brick. And if we have any role, it has to be fast. It has to be impressive and has to be fast. The move from buying a box of Legos to having something to play with had to be simple, uncomplicated, fast. The designers called it cool, crisp, wow. That had to be the emotion kids got when they got it. And then we went out and we looked at kids, and we found that they are way more complex than that. They really should look at their audience with awe and inspiration about the creativity and the complexity of learning and how amazing Lego kids are. And here's an example. We went to Germany, and there was this kid that had ADHD. He was told he had ADHD, so he had no attention span. And that was the whole assumption. Kids have no attention span. So we went, let's go meet some kids that have no attention span. And the first thing we saw him do was playing soccer games on paper. So he would generate imaginary teams that had imaginary players that played imaginary games that generated imaginary statistics. So he would have pen and paper, that was all. And he would have this whole world of imaginary activity. So he would have who scored goals and so on. And we thought, that's not ADHD, that's not short attention span. And then we just found it kid after kid. We found in different versions of it. So the last thing was the kid in LA, that one of the kids in LA, after a while, he showed us, or the researcher showed us a shoe, an old beat up shoe, which was his most prized possession. And the reason why it was the most prized was it was beat up in the right way. So if you are a skateboarder and you go to a skateboard ramp, if you do it enough, your shoe ends up looking like that. So if you want credibility and status and prestige in that system, you better put it in a time and you better hurt your ankles, that was about deep, long-term learning with great complexity and great sort of levels of understanding. That was not crisp, cool, wow. That wasn't fast. That wasn't short attention span. So we just saw this phenomenon over and over and over again in different ways. And then we came back and said, your assumption about short attention span is not true. It's just not the case. So if that's true, what kind of product and design consequences might that have? And then the designers just took it and built a whole new thing around it.
That's amazing. What year was that?
15 years ago, maybe. I mean, mid 2000s, something like that, 2006, 7.
So when I was growing up, I think Lego was doing quite well. I'm 40 something. So, Lego was doing quite well, and they had slow, complex to build models. And that's what I loved about them. And then they seem to have lost their way and then found it again.
Yes. The strategy that was presented by the CEO was called back to the brick. When he presented it, he said, Lego was saved by an old shoe.
What an ideal client. They came with the most interesting questions, and what a brave set of questions. What are our assumptions and where are we wrong? I wish every client was like that.
We had more like that. I mean, after that, Adidas called us and said, is yoga a sport? Is that we have a concept of sport which is about winning and gold medals and so on. Now there's this phenomenon, and that led to all kinds of things by understanding that, which led to what is a big part of their revenue now. But they had to understand, we're a sports company. Is yoga a sport? Pretty good question. So we had this kind of questions over and over again from lots of fun companies.
Yeah.
What is it like to build a home? What is computing? What is this new smartphone thing? What's it like to be a diabetic? What's the relationship to your body when you get old and you want to age with grace? What is class? Lots of questions like that. That's been the start of every project that we've done since then.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow a podcast. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show.
Yeah, that's amazing. It associates your company. You're famous for bringing people from the humanities into the business world. This reminds me of the predecessor to the CIA was called the OSS. And it was just a ragtag team of weirdos, writers, kooky scientists, academics, and also fairly similar to the Enigma effort, where government seems to have a history of, in a crisis, being able to create these elite teams of people that have these diverse backgrounds. Corporations feel like they do that less. I mean, there's this fast sea of people, of very smart people, very capable people emerging from, American universities with humanities degrees, and then they have trouble finding a job, even though they could probably answer many of the most burning needs for these large companies.
Exactly. Well, I think the American military is the biggest employer of anthropologists. And so it exists. And I think if you want to understand the Arab Spring, you better have people that understand that place and so on. And I don't think we really understood it at the moment when it happened. And I think we used too few of those kinds of people to get it. But corporations, Facebook have hired hundreds and hundreds of people in order to try to do this, and really with the right intentions, but ended up mostly using it for UI work and so on, rather than the fundamental tools that a historian could bring. And that's because they don't know what to do with it. And it's hard to anchor it anywhere but the very top. The place that this belongs is to try to understand what on earth is going on around us.
Right.
And the people that usually do that is the very top of companies, not the board. They just mostly sleep and take care of administrative things. But the top leaders, the good ones, is the place to anchor it. And that's not always the case. In good places, it is. But you're right. There is no real job market for it. And we're basically educating historians and sociologists into unemployment because the education system is not prepared, doesn't care really about where the students go. They just educate them and feel good about themselves and then leave them and educate them out of creativity, educate them out of collaboration, educate them out of the ability to see other sciences and other practices as helpful. So I think it's the universities and it's the companies, but perfectly solvable. And mostly it happens during crisis. You're right. It happens when you just got to understand. And then suddenly there's these people around that can actually help.
I hate to say this, but one of my theories is that the business world is like this because the people who control the money are people who are attracted to money, and money it's very left brain, and it's a very particular kind of skill, and you have to like numbers, and you have to dislike risk, and you have all sorts of things that make you the absolute worst person to appreciate a creative person or a humanities person. And it's a massive generalization, but statistically, it's kind of true.
There is a problem there. You're right. In general, I think there's a lot of that.
Yeah, I was just sitting with a friend and his son because the son wanted to choose a career, and the conversation was, well, what's the most practical? Like, this is cheaper, and I can learn a little bit of coding, and I can do this, and I can. And I was like, what do you want to do? What do you like to do, right? and it's like it turns out that he's. He likes music. He likes playing music. Nobody's even bringing that up as a possibility, or maybe you could, code something that has to do with music. But it's a certain type of person, this uber practical person that I meet again and again in the role of an investor. Every time I meet an investor, not every time, there's a few very cherished exceptions, but I meet this overly risk-averse, overly practical person, and I have to speak their language to kind of convince them the design is important. And I can do it because I have the numbers, but really you could have figured it out before if you didn't have to have it translated into numbers.
Right. I agree. I mean, there's sort of a dead look in many of those people's eyes. Yeah. Like maybe because of overwork and just looking at abstraction all day. But there's sort of a particular face you see on investors where they look away, they're always somewhere else. And in a way, abstraction is always the enemy. Right. And if there's an abstract, it's a gamma fund about something that has nothing to do with people and how markets really work. It's just pure math and bad intuition and cynicism. And then they make money, and then they mistake growth and success in the capital markets as genius. It's not. It's a structural change and general growth in markets, and has nothing to do with their genius. It's just that they happen to be in the right market at the right place. If what they want to do is make a lot of money.
Yeah. So I want to talk about your latest book, which is Sensemaking, The Power of the Humanities in the Age of the Algorithm, which kind of connects very nicely to what we've been talking about. And you start by saying, we humans have been getting some bad press lately. and you go through kind of like, oh yeah, we're irrational and efficient, and these slick machines are so much faster. And yet, what's the flip side of that? That's the question you ask. What are humans for? What's the other side of this equation?
I am not at all against technology. In fact, I am deeply interested in it, and I'm not against AI or machine learning or whatever they call it. I think it's fascinating and helpful. I think MRI scans are amazing technology, but thinking that an MRI scan is the same as understanding a human, and thinking that you can reduce us to chemical reactions and neurons firing is just a completely bonkers and untrue. Thinking that algorithms can represent the best picture of what we are and what societies are and how we react when things happen is not true. It just doesn't work that way. So I'm a huge fan of any technology or any data set that can help us understand what on earth is going on. But there was just this hubris of saying it's the only one, and data scientists, you don't need the humanities anymore. And a lot of people said that. Really, why would you study humanities? Why would you study history? We don't need that. We don't even need theory, because data in itself is all we need, because it's a real-time picture of the world. And I think philosophically, that's completely untrue.
Yeah, I fall somewhere in between these two extremes, because I feel like machines that can make hypotheses from data, machines that can advance science radically, like even just the example of AlphaFold, we now have a 3D model of essentially every protein, and it happened like that, like from having just a few to having all of them. And so, and on a fundamental level, they are constructed from the neural network, from the brain. They are embodying a lot of the same principles that our own brains embody. And so I think that if you look at the idealists in Silicon Valley and the people who are talking about AI as the answer to everything, it's probably true. If you're talking about 200 years from now, there's probably going to be a very different relationship where actually probably a lot of theories will emerge and be proven without human involvement at all. I mean, it's already beginning. But that's not devaluing the human for me, because it's modeled after the human. It's an extension of the human.
Right. I mean, technology is the extension of man, right? A hammer is the extension of the fist. And I'd say in my entire life, I've always had machines that were better than me at math.
Right.
Just better processing power. Even the simple ones I had when I went to school were way better than me. So there's nothing new about that. I'm not against or thinking that computers aren't better than us at so many things. The question is it like us? And I think why would you have to say it's like humans? I don't get that. And there's a history with this. I mean, in philosophy, it's called good old-fashioned AI or GoFi. But the assumption there was you can take the human system and you can make the assumptions that we know, the things we know, and you make an endless list of that, and there you get a human. And that's just not the case. So I'm very pro the technology. I think it's amazing what's going on, and particularly in the sciences, but natural sciences. But this idea that it's the same, like a computer can make music based on learning all the music in the world. It doesn't mean that that it's the same as humans making music, right? It can also make new things that we've never thought about, but that doesn't mean it's human. It might be better, but it's not human in that.
There's a few pieces of music written by machines now that I wouldn't be able to tell that it's not a human composer. I'm not saying it's the same. I would always pay a premium for a human creator, but for elevator music, they can create endless elevator music that are interesting and exciting, on brand for whatever building this is, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell. Have you read any of Stuart Russell from Berkeley?
No.
So Professor Stuart Russell, one of the leaders in AI for many years, researcher, he recently published a book called Human Compatible. And that's about sort of the risks in over-relying on AI and developing AI in a way that's misaligned with human interests, but also kind of a proposed solution where you build an inherently unsure AI that's trying to figure out what the human wants, but isn't sure. So they're constantly open to reevaluating whether they're doing the right thing based on feedback from the human.
Based on doubt, basically. A
Based on
machine that has doubt.
A machine that has
funny.
doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a machine that has doubt. And actually, he would say this in a different way. He would say, if you give machines goals, inherently they're going to be different than our goals because you have two separate sets of goals. So you have to not give machines goals. The machine has to be optimizing for the human's goals, and that would be a sustainable relationship moving forward.
But do we even know what human goals are?
No,
we don't agree for sure, right? You can come up with banal things. We want to live longer and we want to be healthier and so on. You can come up with very banal human goals. But once you get into interesting, complicated things, we quickly disagree about it. So even saying to that machine what a human goal would be hard.
Which is exactly the problem that they're trying to solve, because they're not saying once you tell the machine what the goal is, that becomes its goal. And that's dangerous. And so by saying, no, do what this person wants you to do and never even be sure about that. So constantly try to make sure that you're doing what this person wants you to do, and essentially not creating a set of goals, but allowing humans to continue to be the stores of values and different values. So different people would have different AIs. And
I wouldn't even know what my goals are above the banal level. I wouldn't know. I'm not profit optimizing a rational animal like an economist would say. I don't know what the hell my goals are. So how would a machine know?
Well, you might try something and then you go, that's not what I want, and then it does less of that, and then tries something else. I'm not sure. I guess my question to you is, what's important to you when it comes to separating and protecting the human from the machine? What's at stake for you, so that we can make sure that as we build these technologies, we're not harming the human or devaluing the human?
So actually, that's not my interest. So the human is a new concept, right? Us as subjects that stand against objects, and us that is as a self-contained entity, right? People used to be God's children, and still are. People used to be serving the aristocracy or in wars and so on, and basically bodies for serving a purpose that they hadn't chosen before. And in the ancient Greece, right, that I am interested in, sort of life gods were everywhere, right, and they were like us. So this idea that the human is an eternal idea is untrue. So what's interesting to me is how the concept of the human is now being challenged and thought about and experimented with, and big research projects like the ones you're talking about are trying to challenge it. And I think that's amazing. But of course, we have to think straight about the concepts, and we have to have a conversation about what does this really mean about us? And I think there's a chance that we are in the middle of a transformation from one version of us and one way of looking at us to another, just like we were when the nation state happened or when the Enlightenment happened and they came up with this idea of the human that we have now. It's as a subject, as a self-contained entity that is rational. It's not necessarily the case. And you can see that other parts of the world where they don't have the same idea. So having a fixed idea about the human is just not historically correct. So I'm interested in, are there cracks in the idea of the human? And that is not just blanket accepting AI, it's discussing it, trying to figure out, what does this mean? So I'm not against it at all. I'm a huge proponent. I just want to talk about it in a sophisticated way. And sometimes AI people are not talking about it in a sophisticated way. So then they need pushback. And that's what I'm doing sometimes.
Yeah, interesting. You've also spoke about your skepticism with regards to design thinking. And, this is a term that kind of means a lot of different things to different people. So I'd love to hear kind of how you interpret design thinking and what's your criticism.
Okay, so this is a place where people usually take my words and amplify them. So I need to be careful. And sometimes I also amplify them myself. But I'm talking about the bad version of it. And unfortunately, the bad version of design thinking is pervasive, particularly in the business world. So design thinking can be sophisticated, informed, wonderful, and creating some of the most interesting things and breakthroughs that we see. But a lot of it is very instrumental and very quick, very fast research in order to create things you already knew you would be doing. You just use research in order to solidify your argument. And you're not really have doubt. You just come at the problem. We have to do a little bit of research in order to get the inspiration necessary to do what we already would have done. And that's not what design thinking should be, but it is, unfortunately, the dominant version of it. Yeah. If you go to most companies, it's just instrumental in order to design a piece of AI where they choose whether it should be light blue or dark blue, and customer journeys that mean nothing, values that are empty. So it's just my observation of what design thinking is in practice, not the best version, but the kind of the bad version of it.
Yeah, no, so I think we might be more aligned now that I've heard your kind of explanation of this. To me, there's a lot of people who call themselves design thinkers who
aren't designers or thinkers.
Yeah, you know what? That's a good way of putting it. And there's still something that feels very precious to me about that understanding that there are different ways to approach a problem, and an engineer might approach it with one set of tools, and then a scientist might approach it with another set of tools, and that the designer is someone who iterates towards a solution and remains open and curious. And I guess the reason why it's precious to me is because this is how my brain worked my whole life. And then I found a word for it in a way that other people might have with some other identity. I don't know if you noticed like this issue of inflation, certain words or terms, especially in the professional world, just become useless after a few years because everybody gravitates towards them. And then you have to find a new word to mean the same thing.
And they empty out good words. Right? And the consulting industry is just consistently undermining their own language. And it's so boring. Then it's called something new, but it's the same thing and the same people.
Yeah, and exactly.
Now what used to be, transformation consultants are now digital transformation consultants. And people that used to be engineers are now design thinkers. And it's just a hyperbole. And it's too bad for people like you that really care about it, because your language gets undermined.
Yeah, I'm sort of on a mission to redeem the word design. It's a two-directional effort. It's to take that tag away from some people and to give it to people who never call themselves designers, but effectively what they do is build something in conditions of uncertainty and iterating towards a solution. And that is being a designer and trying to figure out what the truth of the thing is.
And designers make shit, right? As opposed to me, I'm just talking and writing and so on. They actually have to deal with the factories and the tooling of the factories and the technology available and so on. And design schools have stopped teaching that and started teaching design thinking in sort of anthropology light. And it's too bad, because they need to make it, make it work. And I have so much respect for that. The same with engineers. If you make a car, it better work, which is the difference from me that just talk about it. So
it's interesting. Like I like the making aspect. I also like the anthropology light, because we should all be anthropologists light in a way. It's almost like the opposite. If you're not an anthropologist and you're also not doing any light version of anthropology, what are you doing?
Fair point. You're right.
So tell me about your current writing projects. There's a couple that I read about that seemed quite interesting.
In the middle of it, it doesn't always seem interesting, but I'm writing a book called How to Pay Attention, and it's about observation. So for the last 20 years, or more, I've collected the best observers I've seen. So the best books, the best artists, the best musicians that come from a place of observation. So these are writers from many different places in the world and so on. And underlying that, there is this philosopher from France called Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who is the philosopher of observation and seeing, what seeing is and what perception is. And his main book is called Phenomenology of Perception. And that is what it's about. It's about that book. But then the examples are this collection of amazing observation that I've found over the years. And it's highly idiosyncratic, and nobody else than me would, I think, collect those. And some people think it's weird that I find this book about looking at peregrine falcons the best observational book in history. But it is to me. And so I'm going to write about it, or I am writing about it. So why Cézanne was a better observer than Monet. So it's a highly personal book, and I hope it'll be what I think it'll be, or what I'm trying to make it.
Yeah, this makes me think of a very different book, but How to Talk to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. And, he's a journalist. His whole life he's talking to strangers, and he suddenly realized, wait, that's the one gift I can give the world beyond, my quirky other books, is How to Talk to Strangers. And I found it to be a wonderful book.
People seem divided on Malcolm Gladwell, right? And I just happen to be on the group that like him. I think he's funny. I think he's insightful. But
the other one that I've heard about is a really interesting play idea. Is that still in the works?
Yeah, it is. It's hard to write because I'm not a playwright, but I have some help. But it really came out of, I'm an observer, sort of a normally quiet person. And I've just been looking at the nonsensical world of business, and particularly consulting, and particularly tech consulting, because I spent some time with a lot of tech consultants. And it's just so mental what's going on. So in order to survive just this absurdity, I always took notes. And I had this little book I've carried around forever that was basically just titled Nonsense. And I wrote down when I just couldn't stand it. It was sort of a way of dealing with it. And then I showed it to some comedians, and they said, oh my God, we only have everyday observation in the streets in our life. You've had access to this. You might not have our skill, and you might not be a comedian, and I'm nowhere near, or I don't have the pretense to say that, but they just said, this material, what could a comedian do with this? It's comic in the case that it happened. So I just took that, and I got some help in terms of creating a story arc and creating characters and all the things I don't know. But it's all based on actual observation over the years. And it's cathartic because it's grotesque. The things I've seen and the way people make decisions in this world is not what you think it is.
And so I know the working title is H1B.
Right.
Why that title?
It's because the main character is from India, because I've observed that some people that came from India and that are just overly smart, and then they come to America on H1B visas and work in America because that's a great change in your life and is something you dream about. And then because of that visa, they're stuck in their job. So I needed a character that just had to deal with the nonsense. They just had to deal with the craziness. And the whole story is basically how the visa is forcing this person to have to live that life and have to listen to those kinds of things, and how he just can't take it. And it's me in a way. But I needed someone to be stuck, just having to look at it, almost like a Clockwork Orange, where you have to look at the horror. And this is not horror, it's just so stupid. And so that's why it's called H1B, because it's what keeps him in that role.
That's hilarious. And I was on H1B for many years and had to observe many things that I couldn't, until I got the green card, couldn't really choose to not be part of. So I have one closing question that I usually end with. In his TED Talk, the philosopher Alain de Botton talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being like the modern day secular equivalent of a sermon. It's just giving you a little bit of information and you make a decision on your own. And a sermon, he speaks positively about this. It's this kind of more urgent plea to really change your life, to really change someone's life. And so if I gave you a stage for a short sermon, what is one thing that could really change how we act or create or behave in this world? What is one thing that we'd really like to deliver?
Okay, first of all, I like the idea. I think great teaching has a prayer-like element. It has a sacredness to it. And I think, particularly, I think in Jewish culture, education has a, sermon vibe to it. And it's amazing when it happens. And I've seen it happen and been part of it. The second thing is, I think, suspending judgment. Not having opinions immediately about anything. Just look and listen to others, to whatever office you're in, to the street you walk in, to quite banal questions like, what are hands? Do they have minds? Do they have memory? What is it like to have coffee? What does that mean when people say, let's have coffee? It doesn't necessarily have to involve coffee. Infused coffee beans. It's something else. So look and listen to things that seem small, but are huge in a way. So suspending judgment probably would be at the core of it. It's deeply ingrained in how we perceive the world. But you can, for a short moment, be in a space where you force yourself not to judge. And that is the skill of observation. That's what good observers do. And then they describe rather than have opinions. Just describe what's going on. And I think good observers have that. Good scientists have that. I've seen great scientists just have that ability. And it's something you can learn, I think. At least I hope, because that's what I spend all my time trying to do. But I think you can learn it. I think some people have it, and I think you can learn it through practice. And in this country, oh my God, do we need it, right? People to suspend judgment about each other rather than judge immediately who someone might be and where they come from and so on. We really need suspension of judgment.
Thank you so much, Christian.
Thank you very much.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.